I've played a lot of different competitive games in my time, hitting the highest rank or close to it, and many of them throughout the years. And while I don't consider myself that old, I've definitely noticed some of my skills deteriorate with age. Mostly my reaction time, or more generally speaking, my speed. It's a skill I'd rely on a lot in games. I was very much a no-brain, guns blazing type of player that relied on my quicker reflexes to win, and it would work extremely well for younger me. I could get myself in the dumbest situations and still manage to come out intact. While I knew every time I did this that it was unbelievably dumb, I enjoyed the thrill in making really risky plays. I couldn't pinpoint an exact moment, but there came a time where I could no longer do this. As my reflexes dwindled, I started watching as my win percentages plummeted, and my other stat lines started to take a hit as well. My self-esteem was crushed, and I genuinely didn't know if I wanted to keep playing competitive games. I was thinking that it might be time to throw in the towel and stick to single player if I were to game anymore. This all might sound a bit dramatic, but competitive gaming was really the only thing I could confidently say I was good at the time, so losing that hit hard. After a while, having slower reflexes wasn't the only thing that I was attributing to my lack of success in games. Not only had my reflexes been deteriorating, I started to notice that a lot of newer competitive games were being made specifically with people that were quick in mind. Which sounds obvious to me now, but when I did have the skills to compete, I didn't realize how much my speed contributed towards my success until I lost it. Newerish games such as Fortnite and Apex had turned the dial up to 11, and for a good reason. With dozens of new competitive games being released all the time, and being forgotten within a few months, developers had to do something to get and hold the more dedicated players' attention. Their solution appeared, at least to me, to be to create games with very high skill ceilings, so that there was always something new for players to improve on. By adding in mechanics such as building in Fortnite, it made it nearly impossible to reach the ceiling in these games, if there even was one. A game like Apex's solution was to make their movement very fluid, while also introducing new characters. Something that Overwatch does as well, but we'll get to that. There's a lot to learn while playing these games, meaning there's a lot to hold your interest. If players aren't being introduced to new concepts in a game, they can quickly get bored, and will ultimately make the decision to move on to the next game. Not only does increasing the skill ceiling get more dedicated players to stay, but it also makes for an incredible viewing experience for those that don't have the same level of skill. As competitive gaming has become more popular, the skill ceiling for these games has increased dramatically. But what about those who don't want to just watch the top players? What about those who want to be able to compete without needing crazy reflexes? You can say forget those players because they're not your target audience, or you can figure out a way to include them. Increasing the skill ceiling can create a huge barrier of entry to a game once it has been around long enough. People that have been playing from the beginning will have learned so much that it can make it more and more difficult for newer players to get into the game. Fortnite and Apex eventually took measures to account for this by adding in modes that allow these newer players and the less dedicated to still have fun. Fortnite introduced their zero build mode and creative maps, and Apex and Fortnite both introduced modes with respawning, so that the less skilled players could still play even if they were being stomped on. All of this is great, but it still didn't change the fact that their main competitive modes had a peak that was unreachable for those that couldn't keep up with the pace of other players. And that's what I think Overwatch does splendidly. I first tried Overwatch during the Overwatch 1 beta, but it didn't really hold my interest at the time, because as I mentioned, I was more of a no-brain, guns blazing type of player, and that doesn't really work well in Overwatch. It's a game that relies more heavily on playing as a team, rather than having a huge emphasis on individual skill. Individual skill is obviously still important, but to win, it takes a backseat to coordinating with your team, whereas I believe you can still be successful in most other games with individual skill alone. This approach to a competitive game is something I find unique to Overwatch, and I grew to enjoy it increasingly over time. So my first time trying the game, I was not impressed. But as I grew older and could no longer compete with what I assumed was the next generation of gamers, I started to lose interest in the games I once loved, and basically ended up shopping around for my next competitive gaming fix. My choices were limited, as I had already tried all the games I could think of, and as I described earlier, I was thinking of just throwing in the towel. 1, because of my decaying skill, and 2, because I no longer had as much time to play anymore, due to an increasing level of real-life responsibilities. But that's when I rediscovered Overwatch. I decided to reinstall it and give it another shot. This was around March or April of 2018, and a new hero had just been released. Brigitte had come out around that time, and people that played a lot of Overwatch were not happy. She was a hero that fundamentally broke the balance of the game at the time, and many of the dedicated player base hated her. Now, I've been saying that I was the type of player that liked to see how much dumb stuff I could get away with just for the thrill, and Brig was the perfect pick for that. She was so strong at release that she could solo a lot of heroes with ease, while still maintaining her health, on top of healing her team by just smacking people around. Since I was fresh into the game, I still had a lot of bad habits that carried over from past gaming experiences, and Brig enabled those bad habits to work in Overwatch. That is, until she inevitably got nerfed. and the more and more she got hit with the Nerf bat, the more I had to learn how Overwatch was actually meant to be played. I had to start experimenting with other heroes to see if there were any others I liked. That's when I started to learn that none of the other heroes were designed to do what I was doing with Brig, or at least they weren't meant to be. This was the moment that it started to sink in that this game was different. I started to notice that instead of the game itself having a high skill ceiling, the heroes were the ones designed with varying skill ceilings. There were heroes that didn't require crazy aim or crazy reflexes, but if you wanted heroes that had those things, they still existed. The game was designed in a way that made it accessible to even people that weren't hardcore gamers. I could pick a hero like Ana and not have to zip around the map to be a valuable member of the team. But if I was playing support and wanted to do something like that, I could play Lucio. If I wanted a hero that required less aim, I had Moira, Brig, or Mercy to pick from. Every role had heroes in it with unique strengths that highlighted different skill sets. A competitive player like me, whose age was starting to catch up to him, could play this game without the need to be good at something like Fortnite's building or Apex's movement to compete at the top. I could take a break from this game and wouldn't have to worry about coming back to 100 new tricks that people learned while I was gone. The most I'd come back to was a new hero or two. It was truly a freeing realization. I had found a game that didn't feel like I had to grind every day to keep up with everyone else's increase in skill. I've been playing Overwatch on and off ever since this discovery, and after a while, I ended up hitting Grandmaster by just learning the game. Not learning how to increase my individual skill, but rather learning how to play with my team in a better way. Overwatch is definitely more of a brain over brawn type of game, and you can reach the top by simply outsmarting your opponents. Overwatch's design allows for players of all different skill levels to have access to competition without alienating anyone. You could have terrible reflexes, but if you learn to track ults and predict your opponents, you could prevent your team from losing a fight without having to outplay your opponents in the form of eliminating them. A lot of heroes have built-in ways to help your team without needing a high KD. If you don't have a lot of time to dedicate to video games anymore, Overwatch can work well for you. The mechanically gifted don't realize this, but their time is limited, and they're going to fall off eventually. I've noticed that with the increasing level of prize pools in competitive gaming, came an increase in the number of players that are willing to dedicate their lives to getting good at these games. Professional players are now playing these games the same way that people that play physical sports professionally do. Some of you watching may not be old enough to remember, so this may seem normal to you, but getting good at games to this level was not something that many players would do before, since you couldn't make a living off of it in the early days. There's a lot of players in this generation of gamers that all have the dream of becoming professional gamers, with sheer dedication alone. I wish anyone trying to do this luck, as the competition is fierce, and becoming even more fierce by the day. Ultimately, most people play games for fun, and winning is fun. Getting stomped on is not. Overwatch, to me, has found the right balance of competitiveness and fun that doesn't rely too heavily on how often you're playing it. My message to those of you that are starting to get a bit tired of the grind of many modern games is to give Overwatch a shot. You may still not be able to reach the top, but I can tell you from experience that it's a much easier game to get good at than many of the other mainstream titles at the moment, because it requires a different set of skills that many that rely on speed and reflexes don't take the time to hone. So when I say Overwatch is for boomers, I don't mean that in the literal sense, that only older people can play it, but it made for a great title. What I mean is that it was made to be accessible to a wider audience. While there's a lot to criticize about the game, this is one thing I can appreciate about it, and I hope that you can too. I plan on making more videos that focus on the design of games and lessons learned while playing them, so subscribe if that's something you're interested in.